Thank
I
you.
really liked it.
Thank you.
I hope that was okay with you and
Buongiorno.
Bonjour. Salamat Sasbui.
Hello.
Привет.
Tashi Dilek.
Merhaba.
Hola.
Ciao.
Merhaba.
Ni hao.
Bye.
My name is Josef Backwiler. I am from South Tyrol, living in Meran, and I'm working at the Center for Autonomy Experience here at the Eurac Research, and I'm a historian of Jewish history and also of minority history in general.
Yeah, my name is Georg Rother, I'm a historian.
Like one misconception or maybe one underrated piece of South Tyrolean history is the Ladin one, like the third ethnic language group, the Romanic group, which is quite important and also like the oldest group living here on the territory. And often the two other groups, which are, so to say, the majority, have little knowledge about this. And I think in studying the third group, this true minority, so to say, here in the region, it helps you to understand also the insights, the identity conflicts, and so of these two other groups. So that's one reason. Then the first and the second one, of course, is that it's very important to know the history of this group. And I met people from those valleys, from the Ladin valleys, and had discussions with them about their view, about how they see the South Tyrolean autonomy, about they feel if they are protected or not. They're living in the two Dolomite valleys in Gröden or Gardena and in Valpadilla. But there, of course, there are there are 5 Ladin valleys in Italy, but divided into 3 like different political realities, like into provinces and another region. It dates back to fascist time. But once this was all together, it's called Ladinia, which means the Latin-speaking world.
Massive, loads. But this is something I can only answer from a very, very, very personal point of view. Because I grew up in Germany, I lived in Ireland for 25 years, and now I'm here. I find the South Tyrolean society very interesting in that you have 2, if not 3 societies. You have an Italian, small Latin one, and a German-speaking one. German-speaking, Italian-speaking, Latin-speaking. And at the same time, the German-speaking society, in which I frequent most here in South Tyrol, is on the one hand more German than the German started. And that is it's a very unrelaxed way of German, because they're focusing on their minority status. A lot of people are afraid of losing the minority status, therefore they cling to whatever is German in their lives and try to sort of push the Italian away. The 2 linguistic groups are not really mingling at all. That's supported by the government. There isn't even statistics on how many marriages there are between Italian citizens and German-speaking citizens. There's a certain segregation. So you can live happily. I live in a little village up in the mountains. Nobody speaks Italian there whatsoever, apart from the tourists that come during the summer, and it's a purely German one. Bozen is different, because there's a lot of Italian spoken here. At the same time, I would describe the South Tyrolean, even the German-speaking society, as highly Italianized in their manners, but Germanic in their language, and even politics and all that. It's very, very Italian, but through the German language. So I find it's a very interesting mix of lifestyle and language, and the attempt to hold on to the German cultural sphere. Many of the people you meet in the streets do not speak 100% correct German. They have problems with the cases, they have problems with minor details in the German language, but they don't mind because they speak with South German dialect, and that's the lingua franca, or that's the German language of the province.
How has the history before World War I played a role into supporting the autonomy or the development of the autonomy here? I think this has to be studied more into detail. As far as I know, this whole autonomy discourse in the 19th century, but not in South Tyrol, but in Trentino, like in the region south of South Tyrol, this was quite prominent there. Like they seeked autonomy for themselves within the Austrian Habsburgian Empire. And I think the elements of this discourse, the content of this discourse, played also a role 100 years later but then vice versa, like then on the German or Latin side, when they wanted the autonomy for themselves within a new state within Italy. So I think this discourse and also certain elements, certain questions, certain also law elements are very important.
So I'm Georgios Kariotis. I'm a professor of security politics at the University of Glasgow, and I work on securitization theory, and I look at crisis management and different issues and how they go up and down in the security agenda and its implications.
So my name is Lena Hansen. I'm a professor of international politics at the University of Copenhagen, and I worked on securitization theory, the concept of security, the evolution of security studies, and post-structuralist approaches to international security and international politics.
David Smith, I'm a professor of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Glasgow, so I work in an area studies environment, but my main interest is in areas of diversity governance, nationalism, ethnic politics, and so on. So that's my kind of academic role.
Yes, I'm Andrea Gavlich. I'm a politics science professor at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, with a special focus on international integration in Eastern Europe.
I'm Matthias vom Hau. I'm an associate professor at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, and I work on nationalism and ethnic conflict, broadly defined, with a regional specialization in Latin America.
Why there's been less attention on the implications of securitization rather than the process. And then the secondary question you've asked is why don't we look at the relational implications of security? So I'll say something that connects the two. First of all, with regards to the overemphasis on the process rather than implications, this is partly because the theoretical framework that the Copenhagen School, the original architects of securitization theory, developed didn't really look at the implications. They focused specifically on process. They somewhat arbitrarily and vaguely said that securitization is bad as a failure of normal politics, although in some cases it might be necessary. And they said that the securitization is ideal. Now, if you unfold all of this, it turns out, when you look at empirical realities, that sometimes there are threats and sudden events that you need to respond to collectively through an effective crisis management narrative, overlaps with securitization rhetoric, and securitization sometimes might need to happen. And then sometimes the securitization, putting your head in the sand and ignoring a problem, or not allowing those that you don't agree with to express that problem, attract attention to that. The reason why we've not looked so much at the implications is because we didn't have the right theoretical and analytical frameworks to do that. Now we've progressed. But the literature, both in security studies but also in other broader fields in public policy and social movements, they mainly focused on implications for a single actor, on my party, for my social movement, for my identity group, or for my state. And then the pursuit in this kind of literature is victory. How do I get my side to prevail in a debate? But victory produces losers, and losers produce conflict. So unless we consider the relational implications of our actions and our practices and our thoughts and our discourses, we are missing out the long-term effects of securitization.
If the concept of visual securitization is a concept used in traditional methods of securitization or is emerging thanks to non-traditional perspectives. And I think that that's a really interesting question. I think there's a sort of, there's been now sort of said that there is a visual turn in security studies, and I'm not saying that myself, be part of that, but there are people who are talking about, a visual turn. And I think that there's sort of different ways to date that. One is to say that if it's in terms of securitization, There was a key article by Michael C. Williams in 2003 in International Studies Quarterly, where he was engaging with securitization, but he was also saying we need to look at the way that images and media, if there are particular ways in which that images are, speaking security. And then that sort of started to be, sort of pick up. And so if you're looking at that sort of 20 years ago, that there have been, a number of contributions to that, both more, sort of going through the concept of securitization, which I'd done in an earlier article, but also developing, research agenda on various ways in which images are part of a politics of representation. So, wars, for example, are brought to us and made meaningful, through images, and that images become, constitutive of, say, sort of, security events or global events. If images in that sense kind of cause a specific politics, but they become part of forming the political terrain, upon which, policy making and legitimation of, security measures and so on take place. But I think also, if you're going further back, then the sort of the concern with aesthetic politics or an aestheticization of politics has also been central to sort of classical, ways of thinking about security in the sort of the broadest sense. Because if looking to the 1930s and to the way that Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy and those regimes were they were very conscious of the power images had. And the famous Leni Riefenstahl, her movie about the Nuremberg Rally, the way that you could look political leaders and look, powerful and mobilized through that. And of course, also if you're looking to the broader kind of, also that it's also sight how you're moving through spaces, the role of architecture and kind of giving that. So I think in that sense, it was also sort of that images have a particular way of tapping into emotions, and that those emotions can be mobilized both for political good, but also in an authoritarian, fashion. And that therefore, the role of the aesthetics was something that it was important to actually think very, carefully around.
Yes, so if you look at the minority protection strategies in Germany, we are very much influenced by the legacy of the National Socialism and the Third Reich, I would say. So we are, on the one hand, trying to be careful with regard to non-discrimination. On the other hand, I think there's still lots of fear with regard to being an attractive countries for lots of migration groups, so many migration groups. So there's some hesitancy in order to broaden minority protection to younger groups living in Germany. And I think it's the minority protection structure we have now with these 4 minorities, it's a bit outdated because it's too narrow. It doesn't really reflect today's challenges, and so therefore I think it should be revised. But due to increased tensions and many challenges, I do not see any political will to revise it. I think because there was lots of somehow also fear and insecurity after the reunification of Germany in 1990. So there was lots of work to do to build a joint country, to reorganize economic structures in Eastern Germany, to cope with different living conditions and so on. So Germany was very much busy with doing all this. Yes, it became evident that there's also in the eastern part of Germany, there's more xenophobia than in the western part. So I think this also was a bit of a shocking moment just to discover that and I think this is one reason why whoever was in government has been rather hesitant of substantially changing the acknowledgement of minorities in Germany. And then later on, we had this, I don't know, since we had the so-called migration crisis anyway, before that in the early 90s, we had already a reaction on this reunification because we became a stricter asylum system inside Germany, and then later on with a huge refugee wave and migration wave in 2015 and so on, there was lots of more pressure also on the German society. And then the right-wing parties, they just gained in more importance, the AfD. So I'm sure all of these mainstream parties, they would like to avoid the discussion on that. It seems to be too risky somehow.
Look, Argentina, my dissertation advisor was a comparativist. So a single case study on Mexico would certainly not fly. And then we looked at, and my interest in was in when, why, and how do states change their, let's say, official discourses about nationhood and national history. And so I focused on Mexico after in the context of the revolution, and then we looked for comparable cases. And so, then it was Peronist Argentina in the 1940s, 1950s, and then I picked in Peru. So Peru as in many ways, very similar country to Mexico, if you look back at its history, but then with a very different outcome when it comes to the transformation of official nationalism, and then Argentina as a case that's very different from the other two. So my dissertation already has had Argentina in it. And then again, look, this was not these are then things that just happened. Then I started a postdoc, and there was this interest of, so I've done all this historical work on the late 19th, early 20th century. I want to do something more contemporary. And I have this interest in indigenous movements. It was the coincidence that there was money available at Manchester for doing a small seed grant type research. And I had a friend, an anthropologist, who was already working on indigenous movements in Argentina, so I teamed up with him. And this is and then I did my first round of field work. That was the logical comparison. Indigeneity in many contexts, many countries, is linked to the experience of European overseas colonialism and being marginalized in the under colonial rule. And this fits for indigenous peoples in the Americas, but also for Native Americans in the US and Canada. It's probably less, or this is distinct from, for example, indigeneity in the context of the Sami that we just heard about in the last lecture. There, I would argue these are indigeneities linked to being marginalized in the context of nation-state formation. So this was not so there we get into the territory what's colonialism, but in my understanding, or in a more narrow understanding of colonialism, I would say they were marginalized and oppressed in a context of the formation of these states. And I think that's one difference to keep in mind. I mean, is it the nation state and its ideology, its aspiration to create a homogeneous national community, or is it a colonial state that tries to extract and institute a clear distinction between colonizers and colonized? I think that's one distinction that shapes differences in what indigeneity means and what its consequences are, and also how it's addressed. The other is, and I think that's the difference between the US and Latin America to a large extent, is whether then indigenous people were considered and dealt with as sovereign nations, at least on paper, that's the United States, or not, whether the post-colonial state engaged with indigenous populations as if they were ethnic groups. Because in the US, you had all these, in the 19th century, all these treaties that were signed. And this implied, the treaties between the Navajo Nation as a sovereign entity. And this also kind of is linked to the reservation policy of concentrating them in certain marginal areas. And this has not been done in Latin America. But the legacy of these kinds of treaties means different kinds of interactions and different kinds of possibilities that Native Americans have today to engage with the state or sub-state in the US, whereas in Latin America, anyway. So I think these are key or important distinctions to slice into, what differentiates, indigenous peoples around the world.
Why do we see nation states often opposing or being reluctant to allow ethnic minorities to seek autonomy as a potential alternative modality for self-determination? And you ask the question, is not autonomy a better solution to potential civil disputes, or at worst, secession or separation of them? Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, if you take the concept of the nation state as classically defined, that is rather problematic. I mean, it kind of implies that the standard modality for national self-determination is to have, a fully sovereign state, one's own, so to speak. And secondly, it implies a kind of congruence between nation, territory, and identity, that there's some kind of undivided, homogeneous entity. And as we all know, in practice, the ideal type nation state barely exists anywhere in the world. To think of an example, and all states are ethnically, culturally diverse degrees, and there are within that there are many different kinds of minorities, and they have different needs, different claims, and probably you need different solutions. But I mean, again, if you take this kind of classic ideal type nation state, then diversity, the presence of minorities, becomes problematic, because minorities can, within that discourse, they can be framed as something that threatens social cohesion, political stability, or at worst, the sovereignty or the integrity of the nation state so defined. And I think what we've got to drive towards is obviously we've got to get away from securitization towards accommodation of diversity. I mean, that's what interests me most of all, and that obviously implies a more kind of pluralistic model in which the state and its national majority willing to devolve power to minority groups by giving them autonomy to run their own affairs. So it's kind of going away from the indivisibility of sovereignty, and sovereignty is something that can be more limited. It doesn't necessarily imply a state of your own. And I mean, there are different modalities of autonomy. Autonomy can be done territorially. You can give a minority group a particular set of rights in relation to a sub-region of a state, or you can grant autonomy on a non-territorial, on the non-territorial autonomy concept. You see a nation or a national minority not as a kind of territorially based entity, but as a community of persons may live, scattered across a particular state. And under that, you allow that community of persons to set up institutions that would have what could be called functional autonomy over certain issue areas. Education and cultural institutions being the most typical one's model. And rather than seeing territorial autonomy and non-territorial autonomy somehow as kind of binary opposite, I think rather they go hand in hand and they complement one another. And the biggest challenge, the most important thing, is to create a secure and a democratic state, and then devolve power according to the most appropriate framework. So you nest it within the appropriate institutional framework, and once that's there, and you've got a platform for addressing these issues. So those would be my overall thoughts.
Hello, good morning. I'm Valeria Bello. I'm a professor at the Universitat Ramon Llull in Barcelona. And I'm an expert on migration and security particularly. To explain a bit the theory to someone who is not familiar with the securitization of migration, I would use this metaphor of the spiral. So what I claim particularly is that prejudice is a situation that creates several negative dynamics that make spiral the process of securitization, makes it increase and increase up to the point in which it becomes the dominating way to deal with the topic of migration. Now, migration could be dealt with in a much more relaxed and normal way in our societies, but unfortunately, due to the securitization of migration, it becomes a topic that sends some warnings about our security for reasons that depend on the way migration is framed by the actors who enter into the management of migration, or the governance of migration. So rather than dealing with it as a normal phenomenon, what we do is to make it a security concern for either cultural reasons or political reasons or other reasons, but this becomes a security issue, an issue that somehow makes us feel that the presence of migrants threaten us for cultural reasons, because perhaps they have different ways to organize their daily lives, or for reasons connected to the identity of our places, or connected to political reasons. Perhaps they would be against the rights for women, and so on and so forth. All these concerns securitize the issue of migration, and rather than treating it as a phenomenon of humans meeting other humans, we see it as a threat. Now, according to my theory, all this happens because there is a prejudicial understanding, a prejudicial cognition of migration, which makes perception of migration as a dangerous phenomenon. And therefore, from here, several negative dynamics start to develop, which put migrants in a position in which it is much more difficult to positively contribute to a society, and therefore they might be caught in situations of insecurities, of vulnerabilities, situations that socially construct them as a threat to the others, and therefore more prejudice is caused, and more prejudice starts to develop, and therefore this prejudice then starts other dynamics of securitization, and therefore from the initial prejudice that we might have, the dynamic spiral, and then counter prejudice again, and spiral again, and becomes bigger and bigger, and it seems that migration becomes a crisis that we have to manage rather than a normal phenomenon. So it's a socially constructed crisis of the society.
Ethnicity, ethnic identity might be related to national identity in two major dimensions. One of them is membership, whether the state in question seeks to limit membership, which is citizenship, to one ethnic category only. Of course, they can't ever fully succeed in this aspiration. But more important is there a legal, institutional, constitutional, official effort to acquire, naturalize, bring to the country co-ethnics who are given citizenship, and to deny citizenship to those who are not co-ethnics. If this is the case, then the state under question is a monoethnic regime. And I call these regimes because state policies towards ethnic diversity are not randomly distributed, I observe, but rather clustered around three major regime types. The first regime type is the one that I mentioned, monoethnic regime, where the state seeks to limit citizenship through discriminatory citizenship and immigration legislation to one ethnic category only. And those groups who somehow acquired citizenship, maybe they were very old indigenous autochthonous minorities in state's territory, are sometimes codified as ethnic minorities to distinguish them from the ethnic majority, which is the titular state-owning group. Mm-hmm. But most states in the world are not monoethnic. And this was an important corrective I wanted to introduce to the literature, because there is the assumption that in parts of the nationalism literature that every nation state is going to tend towards monoethnicity or ethnic favoritism, and that's not true. There are, yes, dozens of countries which have special clauses, financial packages, constitutional and legal provisions favoring their co-ethnics immigration and naturalization and citizenship, but most countries still don't. Which means that most countries in the world do naturalize and allow for the immigration of people from different ethnic categories, different ethnic groups. Not every ethnic category is a group, because it might not be their primary identity, so they don't feel as a group, but let's say ethnic categories. Then the second question becomes really relevant. Does the state in question officially, legally, institutionally cultivate and support the multi-ethnic expression, the multi-ethnic diversity that exists within its citizenry? If it does, then it's a multi-ethnic regime. In many countries around the world, from Canada to totalitarian example, Soviet Union, as long as it existed, from India to Belgium, are multi-ethnic regimes. Monoethnic regimes' historical prototype is Germany and German citizenship law of 1913, but it became quite widespread in much of East Central Europe and in some other parts of the world as well, Northeast Asia, and so on and so forth. So multi-ethnic regime is kind of, in a way, the other end of the spectrum, but somewhere in the middle, one could say, is the oldest ethnic regime type, which is the anti-ethnic regime. These are countries that allow for the citizenship, immigration, and naturalization of people from different ethnic backgrounds, but they do not allow for, and in many cases actively suppress, the legal, institutional, constitutional, and other forms of expression of ethno-linguistic diversity. Mm-hmm. So what they are trying to do is to assimilate an ethnically, linguistically, culturally diverse population into an often monolingual, monocultural, national identity. French Republic would be a prime example, a paragon, a prototype of this regime type, but countries ranging from, Portugal and Turkey to, until very recently, Algeria to Brazil are historically examples of anti-ethnic assimilation states who sought to assimilate an ethno-linguistically diverse citizenry to one official language, one official culture. What is the value added of having this tripartite typology of ethnicity regimes? I think one important value added from my point of view is to finally break with the dichotomy of ethnic civic nationhood, because my criticism, as much as I benefited from works that use the ethnic civic dichotomy, is the fact that the civic category lumps together all kinds of states, such as Canada and France, India and Portugal, together, as if they have a common policy towards ethno-cultural linguistic diversity. And nothing can be further from the truth, right? On the one hand, we have countries that are officially multilingual with multiple ethnic categories in their constitutions, ethnic federalism, confederalism, ethnic affirmative action quotas. Again, Canada, Belgium, India, one can historically Soviet Union. To treat them in the same civic category as the assimilationist French Republic or Turkish Republic for almost all of the 20th century is a major mistake, analytically speaking. And the other part of the problem with alternative classifications is that if you use ethnic as the identifier or adjective modifier of one type of nation state, then the other types should also define, describe the relationship of nationhood vis-a-vis ethnicity. Whereas when you say ethnic and civic, it's not even the same roots, the same nouns anymore. So one of them is, okay, based on one ethnicity, that's why I call it monoethnic. I actually keep the ethnic nationhood category, but then the others can theoretically only be multi-ethnic, which could be bi-ethnic, tri-ethnic, quadri-ethnic, however many ethnicities are institutionalized and codified in the constitution, other legal and institutional features of the state. Or it could be a denial of ethnicity because the state is organized along different lines that emphasizes a completely different identity distinction. It could be an ideology, it could be a religion, it could be some other category, then that would be anti-ethnic. Of course, we can, find subsets, subcategories of anti-ethnic as well. But I try to be kind of theoretically, analytically exhaustive when it comes to the type of relationships nationality can have vis-a-vis ethnicity. That's still one dimension of a complex phenomenon. I zeroed in on the relationship between ethnic diversity and nationhood, and not, for example, how nationality might be related to religious identity, which is a big part, probably the largest part of my current ongoing work, where I'm now seeing, observing, and trying to theorize and also empirically work on how the national religious configurations evolve in a similar way. To what extent are they mono-religious or multi-religious, or trying to altogether downplay religion in favor of more secular, secularizing, anti-religious identities. So that was my motivation in studying and relationship between ethnic diversity and nation building, and developing the tripartite typology of monoethnic, anti-ethnic, and multi-ethnic regimes.
It's somehow a tricky question because I guess not everybody develop a theory in the same way. The way I found very inspiring is the exchange. Mm-hmm. I think this theory has come to me in the exchange with colleagues, in the exchange of my research with others. So I think that, of course, in order to create a theory, you need to observe, because observation for me is the first way through which I start to reflect on possible questions that might arise on a topic. Mm-hmm. And then I need to think about this observations. What I always do, I try to separate what is given for granted about the topic, mm-hmm. and what instead is there,
Mm-hmm.
but is not depicted.
Yeah.
And therefore that depiction of what is not acknowledged in a field is very important. In a field or in a situation is what inspires me to research. But without the exchange with colleagues, this would always remain, I think, an isolated thought, which for how important it can be, without the exchange in conferences, in occasions like this one that you provided to me, an interview, or the exchange with the students, like at the summer school that Eurac has organized within the Secular project, or without the exchange in conferences like the European International Studies Associations, where I actually formulated this theory year by year in our section on international migration, nationalism, and the international interethnic relations. We wouldn't have then the theory. We actually, when I started to exchange on what I was observing with other researchers in the section I chair in the European International Studies Associations, we started to see that there were other researchers that even if they didn't give this theory to their findings, they agreed with the theory I had. And therefore we put together all of this theory. I had meanwhile written the book, because they started in 2015. In 2017 I wrote my first book, International Migration and International Security, Why Prejudice is a Global Security Threat. And then we continued the work along the section in next editions in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. And then in 2022 we published this special issue in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies that collected all the research that we had found within the section that could apply my theory. And then the special issue was so well received, because it actually received 20,000 reads. And so it's the third most read special issue in the journal when it comes to this to the year 2022, and therefore the publishing house Routledge proposed to the journal and to us, to the authors, the editors, me and Sarah Leonard, to publish it as a book as well, so that it could reach also not only the migration scholars, but also those in international relations, because this theory can be applied not only to migration indeed, but can be applied to other fields, because prejudice does not only affect migrants, unfortunately. It affects minority communities, but it affects also everyone. There's different types of prejudice. There are prejudice that are prejudice towards migrants, but there is also prejudice towards women, or towards, persons who are physically unique or different from others, or unique for cultural reasons or for gender reasons. So there are all this
intersection.
Is indeed all this. It is a theory that can be very well used in the field of studies of intersectionality, indeed. And I think that in this way, I can say that the theory always is born in the exchange with others. You definitely observe, think, write, research, have findings, but if you don't exchange with others, it doesn't become a theory. And so it becomes a theory when in the process of exchange it takes its own life, and it is used by others. Without events like this one, we wouldn't have theories. So without events within organizations, associations, conferences, we wouldn't have theories, because I think that a theory is a shared moment in the academic community, and thus can start with me, but if it stops with me, it's not a theory, it's a research project. But if it develops across networks of academics, then it becomes a theory. And therefore, for that, we need the exchange.
That's what I like about academic exchanges that you see how your ideas are applied and where they work and where they don't work, and there's always room for improvement and revision. When I published the article version in World Politics, I already noticed that some things could be fixed for the book version once I published the book, and then move on to the global project with the Marie Curie International Reintegration Grant, expanding this classification to all 172 countries. I saw that instead of 7, I could ask 2 more questions to develop the framework further, and then we could add, similar to ethnicity, religion questions. Instead of 9, we could add 6 religion questions, then we have 15. So this accumulation and revision, which of course we engage in because we think it's improvement, is motivating. I mean, you see the idea's inception and then its growth and its revisions and hopefully improvements, refinements. And if others contribute to that process with their criticisms, constructive or not so constructive, feedback, both are welcome, and that makes it a collective effort and imaginary or real community that contributes to accumulation of knowledge.
Adios. Hoşçakalın. Ciao.
Goodbye. Dadah. A presto.
Bye.
再见. Papa. Hoş buldular. Au revoir. Arrivederci.